alleged member of the Hells Angels motorcycle club appeared in federal court this afternoon.
The Nevada Supreme Court ruling today that the Hells Angels is a criminal gang.
What happens when the world's most feared outlaw bikers are finally forced to face the consequences of their actions?
Hells Angels Motorcycle Club has not been found by a jury in the state of Nevada.
They may sit quietly in court, but everyone knows who they are: the Hells Angels. After years of violence, power, and brotherhood, they are now face to face with the one enemy they can't intimidate: the law. From bloody street battles to courtroom showdowns that shook biker culture, these cases reveal what happens when one of the world's most feared motorcycle clubs is dragged into justice. In this video, we look at the most shocking Hells Angels moments ever caught inside a courtroom.
After a multi-agency operation took down the entire Bakersfield chapter of the Hells Angels, all 7 of them appeared in court today for their arraignment, pleading not guilty.
The judge hadn't even started the hearing before the tension took over the room. 4 Hells Angels, handcuffed and surrounded by armed officers, were brought in to face justice. At the center was Ricardo Alvarez. 41 prosecutors called him the most dangerous man in the Bakersfield chapter. The judge refused bail altogether, saying Alvarez was simply too much of a risk. Beside him were Armando Villaseñor, 55, Joshua Zavala, 31, and Joshua Vaughn, 33. Their charges read like a list out of a crime thriller: robbery, assault, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and even elder abuse. They all pleaded not guilty, but the judge set their bail so high it was nearly impossible to pay. This dramatic courtroom moment didn't come out of nowhere. Just 2 months earlier, Bakersfield had been shaken by a massive raid involving federal agents, sheriff's deputies, and highway patrol. Police stormed homes tied to the Angels, uncovering 25 guns, high-capacity magazines, and stacks of gang gear. Witnesses later told stories of intimidation, abductions, and brutal attacks straight out of a crime drama. And now, with Alvarez and his crew stripped of their patches and standing in shackles, Bakersfield saw something rare: an entire Hells Angels chapter brought into court, forced to answer for years of violence. But the story didn't stop in California. Half a world away, the Hells Angels walked into a courtroom expecting defeat, and walked out with something rare: a victory. Australia's High Court sided with 2 senior members, Peter Keith Stacey and Stephen John Taylor, after they challenged the government's attempt to lock down their Ponde property. Officials had tried to declare it a prescribed place, a legal move that would make it a crime for any Hells Angel to even step on the land. But the judges ruled the government had overstepped because the property owners weren't given prior notice. For a brief moment, it looked like the Angels had beaten the system, but the win didn't last. Within days, South Australia's Attorney General announced new laws would be rushed through Parliament to shut down the pond site once and for all, and for good reason. The property wasn't just another clubhouse. Police had raided it in 2019, finding a burnt-out car tied to the brutal murder of Mark Boyce. Before that, it had hosted everything from biker gatherings to a once famous music festival. The High Court may have reminded the government about fairness, but the case also proved something else. When it comes to the Hells Angels, the law will always find a way to push back. And the fight isn't only about violence. In Canada, the courtroom spotlight shifted to money and revealed one of the Angels' most lucrative rackets: real estate. Investigators uncovered how senior members funneled millions into Southern Ontario housing, turning the property market into their own money laundering machine. On paper, the deals looked legitimate. In reality, prosecutors said, it was dirty cash being washed clean through bank accounts and property deeds. The scheme went even deeper. Several of those properties later went up in suspicious fires. One blaze alone triggered a $7.9 million insurance payout money investigators believe flowed straight back into the Angels' underground network. This wasn't about bar fights or street wars. This was about quiet wealth, power built not on highways, but hidden in mortgages and land deeds. For law enforcement, it marked a new kind of battlefield, one where the Hells Angels proved just as dangerous without firing a single shot. In 2022, a federal courtroom in California delivered one of the harshest blows to the Hells Angels in recent memory. 3 senior members of the Sonoma County chapter, Jonathan John Nelson, Russell Ott, and Brian Wendt, were sentenced to life in prison for racketeering conspiracy and a string of violent crimes tied to the club's operations. Prosecutors described the chapter as a tightly run criminal syndicate, responsible for extortion, witness intimidation, drug trafficking, and brutal assaults. The most chilling evidence was the 2014 murder of Joel Silva, a fellow Hells Angel. Lured to the Fresno clubhouse, Silva was shot in the back of the head and his body incinerated in an illegal crematorium. Investigators said the order came from leadership after Silva dared to challenge their authority. The trial painted a dark picture of the Angels' inner discipline, a world where loyalty is absolute and defiance can mean execution by your own brothers. The life sentences shocked the outlaw world, stripping away the myth of untouchability that had long surrounded the club. But California was only the beginning. If the Silva case revealed the hidden brutality inside the clubhouse walls, what came next would show the violence spilling out into the open, not whispered about, not hidden in shadows, but unleashed in broad daylight on a Nevada highway. On May 29, 2022, a stretch of US 95 in Henderson, Nevada, erupted into chaos. Members of the Hells Angels opened fire on a pack of Vagos riders in what prosecutors later called a coordinated ambush. At the center was Richard DeVries, 66, president of the Las Vegas Hells Angels chapter. Riding with him were Russell Smith, 26, and Stephen Arlo, 46. Within hours, all 3 were in custody, accused of unleashing gunfire in broad daylight. But the real battle wasn't on the asphalt. It was in the courtroom. The case reached all the way to the Nevada Supreme Court, hinging on a single explosive question. Were the Hells Angels just a motorcycle club or a criminal gang? At first, a lower court sided with the defense, striking down the gang enhancements tied to the charges. But Nevada's highest court overturned that ruling. Justices pointed to decades of violence, testimony about the club's hierarchy, and even evidence seized from the Angels clubhouse, like the infamous Filthy Few patch, said to mark members who commit acts of violence for the club. The decision reinstated the gang charges and, for the first time in Nevada's history, gave the courts the power to officially brand the Hells Angels as a criminal gang. For an organization that thrives on reputation, it wasn't just a legal defeat. It was a public scar, one that exposed the outlaw brotherhood to a new level of scrutiny. But while Nevada was busy branding the Hells Angels a gang, Europe was taking things even further. There, the courts weren't just targeting chapters or individuals. They were aiming to erase the club from an entire country. In a landmark decision, a Dutch court became the first in the world to outlaw the Hells Angels entirely. This wasn't about one chapter. Judges banned every Hells Angels operation in the Netherlands, declaring the club a direct threat to public order. The verdict pointed to decades of bloodshed with rivals like the Bandidos, street wars that scarred entire cities, and a pattern of violence too extreme to ignore. The violence is often so serious and causes so much social unrest that it can be considered in contravention of social order, the court ruled. For a group born in California in 1948 and grown into a global brotherhood, it was a historic blow, the first time an entire country had legally erased the Hells Angels from its soil. But while Dutch judges were erasing the Angels from the map, Switzerland was putting its bloody reputation on full display. That same year, in Bern, Switzerland, one of the country's most shocking biker trials unfolded. It all traced back to a violent street battle in May 2019, when the Bandidos tried to plant their flag in Bern by opening a new chapter. The Hells Angels saw it as an invasion. The response was fast and brutal. Stones flew through the air, bats and knives swung wildly, and then came the gunfire echoing through a crowded public square. By the time it was over, one man had been shot and seriously injured, while others lay bloodied on the ground as terrified bystanders scattered for safety. When the case finally reached court, 22 men from both clubs stood trial together, accused of attempted murder, aggravated assault, and endangering the public. Armed police guarded the chamber as sworn rivals sat just feet apart. Prosecutors argued it wasn't a random clash, but a calculated turf war, a deliberate show of force by the Hells Angels to keep outsiders off their ground. The trial ended with guilty verdicts and harsh sentences, cementing it as one of Switzerland's most infamous outlaw biker prosecutions. From California to Switzerland, the message was the same. The Hells Angels will kill to silence dissent, and they will go to war to defend their territory. And whether it's inside their own ranks or against rivals on the street, the price of crossing the Angels is always paid in blood. When federal agents moved in on Douglas Leadham's North Providence apartment, they knew they weren't just targeting another small-time dealer. At 54 years old, Leadham was a full-patch member of the Hells Angels, the kind of man who had earned the right to wear the infamous rocker on his back. That patch carried weight, loyalty, rank, and deep ties inside the outlaw world. What agents found inside his home showed just how dangerous those ties could be. Hidden in plain sight was an arsenal, 2 pistols, a 12-gauge shotgun, a bulletproof vest with police logos, and body armor. Alongside them, 35 knives, 4 hatchets, 9 batons, brass knuckles, and more than 800 rounds of ammunition. And then came the drugs, nearly 40 grams of meth, 19 grams of cocaine, and a handwritten ledger mapping out drug sales like a business plan. Stacked nearby was $6,400 in cash, ready for circulation. For prosecutors, it was a textbook snapshot of how the Angels fund their power. Drugs and guns, wrapped in intimidation. U.S. District Court Magistrate Judge Lincoln Almond agreed, calling the charges so serious that there were no bail conditions that could protect the community. Leadham was ordered held without bail. Assistant U.S. Attorney Paul Daly told the court, "The defendant had many weapons at this residence, the kind of weapons useful to someone operating as part of an outlaw motorcycle gang. The DOJ has long branded the Hells Angels as one of the most notorious biker gangs in the world, tied to extortion, arms trafficking, and meth production, and Leadham fits the mold perfectly." His defense attorney tried to soften the picture, arguing that Leadham wasn't violent and wasn't a flight risk. He even pointed to a moment when Leadham had flagged down police to help 2 overdosing women in his truck. But the jury didn't buy it. The guns, the drugs, and his prior weapons conviction drowned out any sympathy. By January 2020, Leadham stood before a federal judge and pleaded guilty to trafficking methamphetamine and cocaine, as well as being a felon in possession of firearms. The verdict was swift: 7 years in federal prison. For the Rhode Island chapter of the Hells Angels, it was a stark reminder that the patch might command respect on the streets. But in federal court, the law always has the last word. And as Leadham disappeared behind prison walls, another courtroom halfway across the world was preparing to deliver its own judgment on the Hells Angels, one that would change the club's history forever. It was a winter night in the Berlin district of Reinickendorf when 13 masked Hells Angels stormed into a small bookmaker's shop. Their target was Tahrir U, a former member of the rival Bandidos. Armed, ruthless, and coordinated, they opened fire. 6 bullets tore into him. He died instantly. The killing was an execution, a gangland message written in blood. 5 years later, in 2019, a German courtroom delivered one of the harshest judgments the Hells Angels had ever faced. In the country's largest biker trial to date, 8 members of the Berlin chapter were sentenced to life in prison for their roles in the murder. At the center was Kadir P., the chapter leader, convicted of incitement to murder. 7 others followed him into life sentences, while one member who turned informant escaped with 12 years. The trial didn't just expose the brutality of the killing, it also cast shadows over the police, with 3 officers investigated for allegedly ignoring warnings about the planned hit. For the Angels, this wasn't just another feud with the Bandidos. It was a catastrophic loss, wiping out nearly an entire Berlin crew in a single ruling. But Berlin was only the beginning. One of the most dramatic operations against the Hells Angels unfolded in Belgium. when police launched simultaneous raids on multiple clubhouses in Lanaken and Genk, Limburg. What they uncovered looked more like a war stockpile than a biker clubhouse. The sweep was massive. 16 premises raided across the country, 12 suspects detained, and over 50 weapons seized. Among them, 8 firearms, 800 rounds of ammunition, bulletproof vests with fake Belgian police logos, and even a rocket launcher. Investigators said the raids were triggered by a wave of violent incidents tied to the Angels' extortion, drug trafficking, arms dealing, and organized crime. The case also connected back to a cross-border drugs inquiry that had already stretched into the Netherlands and Germany. For the Hells Angels, it was a chilling reminder. No matter how fortified their strongholds might seem, the law could come crashing through the doors at any time. It was a rare moment of reckoning for the Hells Angels in Switzerland. After nearly a decade of investigations and delays, the former president of the Zurich chapter finally stood before the nation's highest criminal court, accused of crimes that exposed the darker machinery behind the club's reputation. The former president was handed a 2-year suspended prison sentence for transporting and dealing marijuana, attempted blackmail, illegal restraint, and even kidnapping. He wasn't the only angel to face judgment. A Lausanne-based member received a 10-month suspended sentence for his role in transporting marijuana, while another from German-speaking Switzerland was fined 7,200 Swiss francs for attempted kidnapping and restraint. A fourth man, however, saw his case collapse entirely, his charges dismissed, and nearly 10,000 francs awarded to him as compensation for wrongful accusation. At the center of it all was a massive cannabis operation in the Eierberg region of Bern. Involving hundreds of kilograms of product, federal prosecutors were convinced the Zurich Hells Angels weren't just bikers, but a criminal syndicate disguised as one. Wiretaps and surveillance from 2003 and 2004 painted a troubling picture. Yet authorities couldn't quite prove a direct connection between the chapter and broader organized crime. Still, the case left its mark. Prosecutors had pushed for harsher sentences, especially for the former president, arguing that the weight of responsibility rested on the club's leadership. And while the sentences were lighter than they demanded, the trial was symbolic one of Switzerland's earliest, most public attempts to crack the Hells Angels' armor of secrecy. Founded in Zurich in 1970 as one of Europe's first chapters, the Swiss Angels had long carried the same aura of fear and loyalty as their American brothers. But after this courtroom battle, their reputation was no longer untouchable. Suspicion of drug trafficking, extortion, and violence lingered heavily over their patch. For Switzerland, the trial may not have destroyed the chapter, but it left a scar and a reminder that the Angels' own motto cuts both ways. When we do right, nobody remembers. When we do wrong, nobody forgets. But as Europe's courtrooms tried to chip away at the Angels' empire, other countries were preparing for even bigger battles against the Brotherhood. From California to Europe, the Hells Angels have faced some of the harshest courtroom battles in history.
Their patch, once a symbol of brotherhood, now stands as a global mark of crime and fear.
Every verdict, every raid, shows that the law will never stop pushing back. But if you think the Angels are the darkest riders out there, click on the next video, where another brotherhood, tied to an even more infamous name, takes center stage.